Hi, virtual students. We're here to finish up Unit 3. As you look at your notes, we're going to be on the bottom over monopolies. Okay, like I said, at the bottom, and then we're actually going to skip back up above and go to these externalities section here to finish things off. So just so you know where we're at, let's get started here. We're starting you off, as always, with the daily blog, writing about something that or somewhere you paid a high price for something, maybe higher than you would normally. Okay, so we're talking about monopolies today, and in our general day-to-day lives, they're probably not quite as popular as you might initially think. We kind of think about monopolies like having some power and making us, have to pay a whole bunch of money for stuff. That in that sense, they don't really exist, but they are pretty common on real specific situations. And so whatever you decided to put down for paying a high price, the thing that pops into my head is if you're ever waited in line at an amusement park, and at least at Cedar Point they used to have pop machines after you were like in line for an hour and you still had an hour left, and the price of the pops were like $4 or $5 a bottle, whatever it was. Well, that's monopoly power. It's a very small part of your life, but that's monopoly power. You could say the same thing about like the concession stands inside amusement parks, professional sporting events, where again, if you're going to buy food while you're in there, you've got to pay a pretty high price. Now, in our day-to-day lives too, we have some monopolies that the government actually creates. We'll talk about those specifically, mostly utilities, but we'll get to that here as we're moving along. Okay, so here's our characteristics of monopolies. All right. We know that there's basically one producer. The product has to be unique. Usually can't have any substitutes in terms of, at that very moment, right? They might have Coca-Cola for sale in line at Cedar Point, which there's substitutes for that, but not at that particular moment. Okay. It's got to be difficult for companies to compete. That can be caused by a few different things. Obviously Cedar Point isn't going to let a McDonald's, build inside their amusement park, right? And so sometimes it's because of property ownership. Sometimes the government says you can't do things. If you look over here at my examples, patents and copyrights, um, and even utilities, which we'll get to a little bit deeper here in a second, the government prevents, people copycatting those things. Okay. And then since I am that only option, I've got a pretty substantial control over prices. Doesn't mean people have to pay it. They can still choose not to pay for it or buy it. But those characteristics that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Huge advantage for businesses in pricing. In terms of an overall economy, one of the disadvantages is they don't have reasons to like innovate. They don't have that competition driving them to, make a better product. So that could kind of make consumers obviously lives a little bit more difficult too, or not as good. Especially if I don't have that competition where my customer might leave. Okay, so again, the advantages for the businesses, the disadvantages for the consumers are potentially pretty extreme. All right. Some terms you might hear thrown around by, I guess you could say the news is sometimes these monopolies are called trusts, and this is when different companies kind of get together, and they were a big problem back in the early 1900s. If you remember learning about Teddy Roosevelt, he was one of his nicknames was the Trust Buster, and sometimes you hear this terminology, antitrust legislation. That's just making sure that companies are or maintaining that competition. Okay, so companies can't get too large and overtake smaller companies. Now, there are some monopolies that are legal that the government really can't do anything about. The first one is a resource monopoly, pretty rare in our economy today. Transportation, communication, all these things that make buying things super efficient and easy. It's hard for a single company to have that resource. I would say the only example that I could come up with would be if a small town only had one gas station, where the only resource was that gas. But for the most part, these aren't necessarily something that we have to deal with, at least here in the United States. Now, some other things that the government creates, we mentioned these patents and copyrights. So if I invent something, okay, I'm the only one that can produce that. And that happens a lot with medicine. Sometimes those medicine companies become, I mean, pretty vilified. EpiPen has a monopoly on their product. They have a patent on it, and they're the only ones that can produce that particular product. And so they charge a high price for it, and that's been under some pretty significant scrutiny by the media, by individuals, because obviously people need those to live, and specifically young kids who can't hold on to them themselves, and schools have to hold on to them for them. I've heard the costs are pretty extreme. But the reason the government wants to create those is because it now incentivizes those companies to invent things, right? And EpiPens make life safer. And so it's a tricky dynamic. What does get a patent, what doesn't get a patent, in terms of those types of situations. But that's where they're probably most common. And besides just the inventions that you might see on TV, like with flex tape or whatever that is sometimes. But there's reasons why that property wants to be, that intellectual property wants to be protected. Copyrights have to do with like writings, and it can even be like art and music and things like that, where I can write about anything I want, but I can't use like Harry Potter's name in a book for myself to make a profit. So, or I can't write a book about him. And so, again, protecting people's intellectual property. Sometimes the government creates what's called public franchises, where in our case here at Concord, we're a public school. Only Pepsi is allowed to be sold in our sporting events, or if they have concessions at musical events or whatever, right? And so again, they have monopoly power in this small instance where they're the only producers of stuff. The trickiest one is this idea of a natural monopoly. Okay, and if you look at my examples, they're the utilities, and those utilities of gas, water, electric. Depending on where you live, you have city water. You might have well water too. Basically, what the government says is, hey, listen, we don't need competing electrical companies because there's too many electrical lines anyway. So we're going to monitor. We're going to monitor this stuff and make sure that the prices don't get set too high. Okay, and so the government limits competition in those particular things. Usually, it's looked at as pretty efficient. It makes it a little bit. I haven't heard too many people complain about prices of those things on a consistent basis. We talked about these consequences, setting prices without competition. We don't have to innovate or satisfy. I could get into situations where I were to price discriminate as well. That would probably be most specific with like health insurance for like old people. If I were able to do that as an insurance company, making people pay more money that really need something, that would be an example of price discrimination. We talk about health insurance in a different chapter. All righty, go ahead and give me a true or false for these four questions. All right, so the last section of things we're talking about today has to do with byproducts of the government not getting involved. We like to consider ourselves, a capitalist economy. We're extremely efficient, and by being able to do that, it keeps prices down, et cetera, et cetera. But as you probably can assume, businesses also figure out ways to cut costs as much as possible. One of the biggest things, the biggest costs a lot of companies have right now is disposing of waste, right? And one of the biggest challenges that our, planet has right now is probably, you know, curbing our pollution. And so as we move into the future, okay? And so anyway, when companies are trying to cut costs as much as possible, they don't really have a reason to pay to cut their pollution unless the government makes them. Okay, and so you give a true false for here, for these three. Kind of depending on where you're at. You know, if you think that pollution is a major problem, if you think that pollution is a small problem, wherever you're at, right? I think we can all agree that if a river catches on fire, and this happened in the 1950s and 60s in Cleveland, okay, that I think that that is too much pollution. Okay, so whether it's a problem today, whether it's becoming a bigger problem, whether it is the biggest problem in our society, wherever you stand on that political spectrum, Again, I don't think we want our rivers catching on fire. This happened in the Soviet Union, well, in Russia, sorry, um, back in the early 2010s. So again, pollution, if it goes unchecked, can become a major, major problem. Pollution is the biggest example of what we call externalities. Okay, and these are side effects of production or consumption that consequence people besides the consumer and producer. So obviously, if I have asthma and a company pollutes, and I have an asthma attack and I have to go to the hospital, right? Um, the company's not going to pay for that, and so that cost is on me, not on the producer. Okay, and so that's an externality. Now, sometimes we can have what are called positive externalities too. So to give you a little bit of a different example, let's say that you have a house, and right before you're about to move, you decide that, or I'm sorry, a smelly factory, or better yet, if you are in our part of the country, a train track gets built through the backyard. Okay. And so a train track now goes through your backyard. What's that going to do to the value of your property? Well, it's going to drive your property value down because no one wants to live that close to um, the train tracks. And on top of that, too, you also paid for the house without the train tracks there, right? So the train track company wouldn't necessarily have to pay for that. That's a cost that's going to fall on you. Okay. Now, we also have positive externalities. If you live across the street from, say, a school, or I'm sorry, not a school, and then a school gets built, that usually adds value to the property. And those, so there are some things that add value to things as well. The other thing that our private businesses don't produce are things they can't collect profit on. Fire and police services, again, those are not necessarily profit making enterprises. They don't get paid when they show up, right? They protect us when there's emergencies. Same thing with the military. In some cases, healthcare, the government's trying to provide that for some groups of people, or at least make it more accessible. And public parks too. And so the government provides some of these things because, like I said, at the end of the day, private businesses haven't figured out ways to benefit from them, right? And so the government obviously has the ability to collect taxes. That's how they're going to make money to pay for those things, and from there, obviously, hope they make that as efficient of a service as possible. All right, that's what I've got for you for Unit 5. I'm sorry, Unit 3, Part 5. We'll talk soon. If you have questions, make sure you get